Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah, and today's video is all about the mitochondria with a particular focus on how they work on the inside. So looking at the electron transport chain and how that's really important for things like aging, inflammation, how free radicals are produced. Not all free radicals are bad, by the way. And also it'll give you an insight into how ketogenic diets and cold have a little bit of a link together, because I'm going to go into uncoupling as well. So this video is suitable for people of all levels, and it's based on some talks I did at some conferences this year on the mitochondria. So I hope you enjoy the video as much as the people who I presented to did. If you want more content like this, then check out my new Quantum Starter Kit course. It's $19 and it covers not just mitochondria, but other aspects of quantum health. So it's a really great way to get a good grounding in the basics and the foundations. So let's dive in. Let's begin. So we're going to dive into a mitochondrion and just look at the electron transport chain, touch on cold and ketosis. I'm also going to briefly go over something called dissipative structures, because this is important for understanding some of what certain scientists view of what life is, but it does tie in with lots of other great thinkers, for example, Dan Winter and Paul Harris and Bob Greenier, who talk about neg entropy, or how creating order is important for life, or basically is life. So let's begin. With our mitochondria, they are a relic of a bacteria, and just a little bit about microbes in the body. They do outnumber our cells by about 1.5 to 1. So this includes everything like amoeba, fungi, and other organisms. So we are more bacteria or organisms than we are a human cell. For bacteria, there was a study done in the 1970s which said it was 10 bacteria to 1 human cell. That's been redone, and it's more like 1.3 or 1. So the crux of it here is that we are more bacteria than we are human cell. If we now add the mitochondria in on top of this, there can be 100 to 2,000 mitochondria per cell. So for certain prokaryotes, which a mitochondria is a relic of, do outnumber our cells hugely. And the mitochondria do have some of their own DNA. I've covered this in another video. And different cells have different amounts of mitochondria depending on the energy requirements of those cells. And red blood cells don't have mitochondria. And something like ovaries and the heart, they are very dense in mitochondria. So, of course, the mitochondria and our other microbes, which predominantly live in the gut, but we've got a microbiome everywhere, in the blood, in orifices, on the skin. They do mind what we eat, and they do control us. The mitochondria are, of course, important in metabolism because food ends up as protons and electrons in the mitochondria. As I've said already, the mitochondria are small special organelles inside a cell, and what they make is energy. Originally was believed to be ATP as the universal energy currency of the cell, but then Dr. Gilbert Ling, and then I think there was another study, repeated this and found that thermodynamically, or by using maths, analyzing things like Gibbs free energy, it's not possible for ATP to be able to run all of the processes in the body. It had to be the water. Now, mitochondria also make light, and inside the body, we would call the light that we make biophotons, and it's different to the light that is outside because it's much more coherent and laser-like. Mitochondria also make heat, and this is important when we briefly talk about dissipative structures. They also make carbon dioxide, which definitely isn't a poison. It's an extremely important signaling molecule. And if you explore the work of people like Anders Olsen and James Nestor, you'll really understand how important breathing and carbon dioxide are. So the mitochondria make that as well. They also make hormones, namely pregnenolone being the most important for making our sex hormones. So that would be things like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. But they also make some neurotransmitters like melatonin for themselves, and also some dopamine. They make heme too, which is a cage-like molecule, which is important for holding molecules like iron, which are very reactive. And also mitochondria make free radicals, which are very important signaling molecules, but when in excess, they can be harmful or damaging. But again, things like inflammation, hormesis, and stress are something that's really important for how we actually adapt or evolve. So a little bit of stress isn't going to hurt anybody. It's actually very helpful. That would be a hormetic effect. But in excess or all the time, free radicals at the wrong time or in huge amounts or without a break or without proper organization are going to be problematic. Then how do mitochondria relate to food and metabolism? So I mentioned already that electrons and protons end up in the mitochondria, but also reactions like the beta oxidation of fat and the TCA or Krebs cycle occur in the mitochondria as well. Researchers like Doug Wallace, who's probably the best well known when it comes to mitochondria, it was his quote, and he said that about 85% of chronic disease is from malfunctioning mitochondria. He'd probably say that number's more, but as research comes out on a whole wide range of chronic illnesses, ranging from insulin resistance, diabetes, cancer, all sorts, it always comes back to the mitochondria, because regardless of people just thinking, oh, they're a powerhouse and make ATP in a very simplistic level, just having a flat biological battery alone is going to make you not have the power to be able to function. But because the mitochondria are a lot more than that, they do way more than most people would even care to imagine. And they also communicate with other cells in the body. So they are really important, and it's important to understand them and look after them. So for people that like pictures, what goes into the mitochondria, we could say food, and then water, because they are effectively bathing in an ocean of water. Electrons, because electrons other than food sources can enter the mitochondria. And of course, light is something that goes into the mitochondria as well. And I left oxygen off this picture. There just wasn't space. So that goes in as well, because it's the terminal acceptor of electrons, as in it's the end of the conveyor belt, the oxygen, and it's part of, or the key part of, how water's made. Then we've gone over what comes out of the mitochondria, which we could say metabolic water, which is deuterium depleted. So this will contain energy as well as information, because water is much more than just a liquid for dissolving things in. That I could do a whole video just about water, but people like Dr. Pollock have been on the channel, and hopefully Veda Austin will come on. Mitochondria make ATP, which some people are now beginning to dispute this so-called high energy phosphate bond, but still ATP is an extremely important molecule in the body, and it does power certain reactions, and it's important for folding and unfolding proteins, but it does more than that. So that's very important as well. The mitochondria produce heat. So this is a way of being able to dissipate energy, because biological systems don't like being at equilibrium. They exist far from equilibrium, but they don't like being in this potential difference, or nature doesn't like differences in potential. It's constantly creating this potential, but also dissipating this energy in order to be able to lower the entropy and create order or structures. So also the mitochondria produce carbon dioxide, as I've said, and then they emit light as biophotons for signaling. So we'll go inside a quantum microprocessor. So this picture here, if you're just listening, I'll try and describe it. So in the inner membrane space in the mitochondria, we have a lipid bilayer, and within that, there are embedded 5 proteins or 5 structures. And what's important about these is they are things like cytochromes, or they contain ion clusters, which means they can participate in redox reactions. But more importantly, cytochromes are colored molecules. So there's an extremely important aspect of how light works in the mitochondria. And then we have the ATP synthase, which some people say isn't a rotating nanomotor where protons go down and ATP comes out. But until somebody finds a better explanation for what that is, this is the current view of how the ATPase is set up. Then in the electron transport chain, the electrons, or we can call them a negative charge or an electric field, travel down these complexes. And as they do this, H plus or proton is pushed up into the intermembrane space. So this creates a potential difference. So as I said, as soon as there's a potential difference, biology is very keen to dissipate this energy, and it just goes on and on and on, doing this dissipation of heat or energy or creating order, which is things. So we can create water in the mitochondria. Then, of course, we create ATP. And separate to the electron transport chain, the mitochondria make other things. Of course, then CO2 is produced as well. So here's a little diagram that I drew to see if I can make it simpler and understandable for people who are new to this kind of subject, because I did do a degree in biochemistry, and I can assure you that if you try and read about the electron transport chain or oxidative phosphorylation, it's the most dry and boring thing you could possibly imagine, and it doesn't actually tell you really what's going on, nor anything about how to help your mitochondria. Let's take it back to a very simple level. How can we break the respiratory chain? Because if the mitochondria are pivotal to life, and if they break or malfunction or stop working, the organism, in this case us, would die. Most people have heard of barbiturates, and they actually block complex number 1. So that means the electrons can't flow down, and then there's no proton pumping. So we've created a block at the first site, the first protein in the electron transport chain. And pretty much everybody's aware that if you take an excess of barbiturates, they're actually fatal. So we can think, oh, okay, I can see now this mechanism of how that could happen. And another one would be cyanide, that everybody's familiar with, and that blocks complex 4, the one which makes water. So it again is going to block the whole electron transport chain, and the mitochondria not able to function. And again, if you poison people with these things, they die. On this subject of mitochondria and poisons and toxins and hormesis, what's really important in this is the dose dictates the poison, because there are lots of compounds which are hormetic, for example, things like resveratrol, CBD, curcumin, these kind of molecules. And originally people just thought that they were AMPK activators, or they had beneficial effects by binding to other receptors. For example, for cannabinoids, it would be CB1 and 2 receptors. But when scientists have dug into this a bit more, all of these molecules also interact with or have a relationship with the mitochondria. So when it comes to hormetic stress from nutraceuticals or plant compounds, it's not necessarily going to be harmful for a person unless they're already very unwell, because, as I've said before, a little bit of stress is going to make the organism actually stronger. And when people have added, say, toxins to bacteria in studies, sometimes if you don't actually kill them, you just tickle them a bit with some toxin, they actually grow better. And the example of this is when, I think it was mainly the UK, but I think it happens all over the world. They used to over-dilute certain phenolic compounds for use as disinfectants in hospitals, to the point where it didn't kill the bacteria. They actually were able to thrive on it and eventually feed on it. So it's a whole other topic, talking about different things which affect or harm the mitochondria, because there are new studies looking at how certain nutraceuticals, which do have a hormetic effect, may actually be helpful for the mitochondria. Straight out toxins like heavy metals, antibiotics, and things like that, the dose and the nature of the molecule is going to be not helpful, but destructive. But I've digressed a little bit. So if we come back to the electron transport chain, because I did mention damaging or harming mitochondria. So what can happen is this particular respiratory chain, so the membrane and these proteins are in it, and their job is for the electrons to travel down this chain as quickly as possible without losing electrons on the way, and then the protons get pumped into the intermembrane space. The protons come down through the ATPase. We make ATP, we make water. So just if we think about it as using time as an example, if the complexes are spread out because the membrane's expanded or swollen, it's just going to take longer for the electrons to complete their journey. And this is going to result in less energy efficiency and more electrons being lost on the way. Because in simplistic terms, we can think of current and water flow, and also people a lot of the time, as wanting to always take the path of least resistance. So when the electron transport chain is spread out, the likelihood of a stray electron, which then will be called a free radical, coming out is more likely. And lots of different things can cause expansion or swelling of this respiratory chain. And in simple language, we would call this inflammation, but also it ties into something called mitochondrial heteroplasmy rate. But this also ties into other factors in how efficient the mitochondria are. So if under certain circumstances of, say, bad lighting, too much non-native EMF, toxins to the mitochondria, inappropriate ways of eating, like far too much sugar and carbs all the time, that's going to push a lot of electrons all the time through complex 1. And over time, this is going to cause spreading out of the chain. But other factors do it as well. But it's not all bad news, because we can contract the chain as well. So this is how time in some ways relates into aging and anti-aging, but also time is a big component of something called negentropy and centripetal forces and creating order. But just in simple terms, if the electron transport chain is very spread out, it's going to take longer for the electrons to get to where they're supposed to be going. And this is just not efficient energetically. It's wasteful, and it's also going to be oxidative in the end. Right. Okay, so if we now come into the opposite, so if we think about something like cold thermogenesis, where there's quite a lot of studies, and there's now some human studies as well, but it's difficult to study sort of death studies on humans, but we can on other organisms. So it's quite well known that cold exposure does compress the electron transport chain, and therefore it increases the overall efficiency of electron transport or flow and function of the mitochondria. So it's the complete opposite to when the electron transport chain gets expanded. So the electrons are going to get to their destinations more quickly, more efficiently. So therefore we just get more water out, more ATP, more carbon dioxide, and less loss of electrons on the way, which in some ways is a way to describe inflammation or oxidative stress. Another thing is ketosis or ketones. They can cause uncoupling as well, but it's kind of mild uncoupling. So there's traditional uncoupling agents, which like DNP, which collapses the proton gradient. So they're a true uncoupler. And they were originally discovered because it's part of making munitions in munitions factories. And then they discovered that it caused people to get hot and lose weight. And then further studies were done on these uncoupling agents. So that's the kind of history of a true uncoupler. But then things like cold and ketosis, we can say that they do a form of uncoupling, because more energy is then dissipated as heat. And this is back to the dissipative structures. Also, when the more heat is made, it's going to change the properties of water by expansion, which then is going to have an effect to compress the electron transport chain. So ketosis, like cold is a stronger compressor, but ketosis will as well. So this is another reason why being in ketosis is more beneficial, because of this uncoupling effect, meaning that the electron flow is more efficient. This was the first paper I found on this was in 2000. And then since then, there have been a variety of publications on uncoupling in the mitochondria and ketogenic diets. Also, just back to this idea of hormesis, because circadian eating, it does make a lot of sense, say eating plants that you grow in your own garden or backyard or in your locality in the summer. What will happen then when you eat glucose, the electrons from the glucose, they're going to go through complex 1, which is the leaky complex. So more free radicals are going to be produced, but this can actually be very beneficial, because it's going to trigger things like autophagy or mitophagy and other forms of autophagy to trigger getting rid of old and damaged cells. But then you're not supposed to eat fruit all the time, because it's only around for a short period. So this is the whole point of these kind of signals or plant molecules, is they're only around for a short period of time. But again, it's completely up to people what they eat. You can be whatever you like. I don't identify as anything, but it's all about understanding, okay, this is what eating in this way could potentially do. But however, if glucose is consumed, which it does happen, people just go out for a meal with their family, it's not necessarily going to be hugely harmful. And it's also why some people find eating produce or growing their own produce to be very beneficial for them, whereas other people just function great in ketosis all the time. So what we've covered now is we've covered how the mitochondria should work. Then we've looked at two different scenarios of where the electron transport chain is expanded and everything's less efficient. Then we've looked at two examples of when the electron transport chain has been compressed. So that would include cold and also ketosis. I haven't gone into magnetism because this might be a bit much for somebody who's not really heard many of these terms, but magnetism can increase the velocity and it has an effect on the spin states of electrons. So magnetism also is beneficial and has the potential to have a contracting or compressing effect in the mitochondria. But this is kind of pretty well known. It's not only Dr. Dean Bonnelly who's studied the effect of magnetism on mitochondria. In places like the Guy Foundation, who are very interested in space travel, they've done a lot of research looking at astronauts and what happens when they're removed from natural magnetic fields and how rapidly their aging happens. Also, gravity is important as well, because when the astronauts go into space, there isn't any gravity. And that's another interesting topic to do with physics and energy and life. And I'll let Dan Winter explain that because I have done my podcast with him. It just needs a little bit of editing to help you be able to appreciate what he's trying to tell you. But if you look at the Guy Foundation, they've also talked about how gravity plays an important role in mitochondrial health, but that's for another day. I just want to touch on something that came up in my membership group because a member was asking a lot about iron changing oxidation states, but I think a lot of the time people hear words on the internet and not really sure what they actually mean. So we'll go over it briefly, but I just need to, we'll go over it briefly. So we've got the ferrous iron or the Fe2 plus or iron 2, and this is the reduced form, and this is the one that participates in redox reactions, but then it can't participate in a redox reaction unless it turns into iron 3. Also, the ferrous form is in hemoglobin, myoglobin, cytocrines, the iron sulfur clusters in the respiratory chain, and certain enzymes. And then the iron 3 or the ferric iron, that's the oxidized form, or just in simple language, rust. And this form needs to be safely transported around the body so it can't be overreactive. So this is where storage iron molecules like ferritin or transferritin are important because they can change the states of iron, or they're able to cage iron. And also the mitochondria play a big role in iron transport. There is another form, the iron 4, the ferril, and that's very interesting and related to making water in the mitochondria because this form of iron is very, very reactive and it's often associated with oxygen chemistry, so it's only around for very brief moments. And this form of iron, one of the biological sites I know it appears is in complex 4 where water's made. So this is where the proton, the electron, and the oxygen combine to make water. This is the end of the electron transport chain. And there's a reaction where the iron 4 is involved in this as well. Because if we think about redox reactions, it's that word you learned at school, the oil rig. Oxidation is loss, and reduction is gain. And we're talking about molecules gaining and losing electrons. You can also transfer it into talking about gaining and receiving a hydrogen. But talking about a redox reaction, we're discussing a molecule donating electrons or receiving, and then a compound will become reduced or oxidized, and we can get oxidizing agents. For example, alcohol is an oxidizing agent. And then we also can get things like reducing agents, which donate electrons, and oxidizing agents take electrons or receive one. So this now ties me back into just a little bit more about the electron transport chain, because within these different proteins, we've got something called iron sulfur clusters, and then complex 2 to 5, they would be described as a heme or a cytochrome. So the iron changing rapidly from the iron 2 to the iron 3, or changing oxidation states, is an extremely key part of how electrons move down the electron transport chain. There is more to it again, because now with the advent of quantum biology, as in the actual science of studying quantum effects within biology, the electrons do something called quantum tunneling. And this was originally, this has also been linked to quantum effects in the chloroplast. So with the quantum tunneling, this is exhibiting a quantum phenomena. So the way the electrons actually move down the electron transport chain is extremely complicated and interesting. However, because I made the simple stuff first, just told you being in ketosis is going to make your electrons move down the electron transport chain more efficiently, and also that cold thermogenesis is a method to compress this electron transport chain. Sometimes you don't need to know all of the details and the science, but sometimes it's useful to understand certain words like oxidation state. And then it helps you to understand other more complicated podcasts where oxidation states of iron is discussed. So it's nothing, there isn't a bad iron or a good iron. It's all about the wrong form of iron being in, well, the iron being in the wrong form at the wrong time. So it's just a lack of organization or coherence or timing in the body. I've done several videos with Morley Robbins to talk about the biochemistry side of ferritin and iron. Was more just the sort of physics and chemistry side. And this is just a picture I found because I looked up some of the iron examples of iron redox states in a paper. So I've referenced it here if you want to look, because sometimes it is better to read a journal, find the diagram and the description there, because at least within reason, journals have been checked. So this is just a picture showing the different states or forms of iron, Fe3 and Fe2, or iron 3 and iron 2, and different molecules that I've talked about with you, such as transferritin and the mitochondria, and how these forms of iron change form in order to do their jobs. There's also an important part of DNA repair and synthesis that uses the iron too. So iron is a really interesting and important molecule in the body, but it has to be kept under control because it's not very friendly in the presence of oxygen in the wrong form. But like everything, it's always about having the Goldilocks amount of iron. Too much is bad, not enough is going to be bad. And just bear in mind that we recycle about 98% of our iron anyway. And people who have things like anemia, you really do need to check all of the iron pathways, because it's something that's complicated, but it's quite simple if someone like Morley, who's studied it for a long time, explains it to you. So the take-home message there is you don't need iron supplements. RTFL, read the effing label with food that comes from a factory, because they add iron to all sorts of things. Random foods and grains and flour have had iron added to them, and sometimes it's not even on the label. Protein bars and powders and stuff like that. Also multivitamins and supplements, always read the label, because they sneak things like vitamin D into them, sneak iron in, and you think you're buying one thing like digestive enzymes, and when you read the label you think, well, why is there vitamin D in here as well? I didn't order that. I now just want to touch on another idea about mitochondria and what they are. So this is titled As Above, So Below, because when nature gets a good idea, it likes to replicate it all over. So we get lightning strikes from potential differences between the ionosphere and the Earth. But if we think back to the mitochondria and about what they are, that they're also a little capacitor. And interestingly, the electric field strength across the mitochondrial membrane is about 30 to 60 millivolts per meter. And the lightning bolt field strength is 3 millivolts per meter. So the mitochondrial membrane actually has 10 times the electric field strength as that of a bolt of lightning. So another way we can think about mitochondria is that they are something that can compress charge or electricity into life. And then on the subject of life, you may have heard of something referred to as a dissipative structure. And this is what people like Ilya Pirogin, who won a Nobel Prize for his work, then other scientists like those at the Gaia Foundation, such as Alistair Nunn, talk about this a lot. These aren't the only scientists, and this idea of dissipative structures and the question, what's life, has been going on forever, ever since humans have been able to start to question things and study. So anyway, with a dissipative structure, it's a consequence of thermodynamics, and it's a way that the organism can organize itself to dissipate energy and restore equilibrium and thus create order or neg entropy. And things like the movement of charged particles and electrons and protons, this is fundamental in the ability to dissipate energy. Heat is pretty much the best well-known way in which biology dissipates energy. So as I said before, when you've got potentials or potential differences in biology, like in the mitochondria or everywhere, membrane potential, for example, nature doesn't like these potentials. So the laws of entropy basically say the best way of dissipating this entropy is to get organized into a structure and then dissipate that energy. So that's kind of the simplest way I can describe it. And then these ideas of creating order and dissipative structures, it's one of the ways in which we can start to look at adaptation or evolution on a more physics level, sort of separate from the genome. As I mentioned, Dan Winter, he actually also talks about neg entropy and talking about how this is moving towards order and complexity. But he talks about it more in the sense of charge collapse or charge compression, and it's connect with fractal geometry. And he also talks a lot more about how the golden ratio is vital, or compression at golden ratio is very negentropic and is important for life. But in lots of ways, when you start to look at different people's work, a lot of the time they're describing the same thing. And what I'm trying to say here is that there's a lot of physics that we can start to learn about anti-aging, which actually doctors and scientists don't really know exactly what that is anyway, or what life force is, because if they knew that, we'd have a machine that we could plug into to put our life force back in if we needed it, but we don't. And then also this subject of structure and charge and etc. and geometry, how we actually have shape is an effect of charge as well. So I've kind of accidentally digressed a bit because I don't want to make this too complicated. I just want to show you that there's a lot more to the mitochondria than just looking at things biochemically. And also there's a lot more to anti-aging than just taking supplements and having surgery. And just on the subject of anti-aging and people like Dan Winter, the ancients, meditation, monks, bliss states, if you look in PubMed, there are actually papers to say that meditation can lengthen telomeres, but also there's the whole physics aspect of negentropic coherence in the body, such as things like heart math, and then having overall coherence in the heart, the cerebral spinal fluid, all of the brain waves, which create a compression or a squeeze, which then can stimulate glands. And then this can help people access bliss states, or some people might want to call it Kundalini or Christ oil, or lots of different descriptions of the same thing. So I've definitely come across and met people who are very into spiritual practices and nature and look 40 years younger than they are, and witnessed amazing feats by people in their 70s and 80s, physical feats of what they can do. And when I ask them and talk to them, even if they didn't really understand quantum biology, they definitely don't take supplements or stem cells or have surgery and things like that. They harness the powers of nature for anti-aging. And then, of course, just things like mood and love, which is a very compressible wave, the opposite to, say, hate and anger and stuff like that. There's a huge link into your mood and aging and happiness as well. So everything isn't biochemistry. And even if I've now started to talk about things to do with emotions randomly in with our mitochondria, it still matters, because when we get stressed, our microbiome gets stressed and they produce stress compounds, which stresses us further. And then the mitochondria have linkages to bacteria and our genome in the body. And there's studies by people like Glenn Ryan that have shown that changing our emotional state can alter the way in which the DNA helix winds and unwinds and possibly even repairs itself. So there's so much that we don't know, but there's a lot that we do know. And it's just about how there are lots of practices beyond just biochemistry that people can do for better health. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this useful. I also presented this to my membership group. So if that's something you're interested in, you can check out the links in the description to my membership group and also my Quantum Starter Kit, which is a very affordable $19 course that will help to guide you through quantum biology. So it includes mitochondria, but also lots of other things as well.